It is not a story of glory, but a slow, agonizing crawl toward ruin. Everyone knows Agincourt was a miracle where 1,000 English defeated 20,000 French, but the truth is darker. The official death count, a mere 100 English, is a calculated lie. It hides a battlefield so horrifying it turned an army into a single, massive pile of human wreckage. This is the real story of Agincourt, and it begins with a doomed army begging for a dignified death. August 1415. Henry V, the young King of England, landed his army on the coast of France with dreams of reclaiming the throne. The initial target was the port city of Harfleur. The siege was no quick victory. It was a disaster wrapped in a success. The French held the English at bay for over 5 weeks. The cost was astronomical, not in steel, but in human life claimed by the invisible enemy, disease. Harfleur was a swampy, pestilential place, and the English camp quickly became a breeding ground for dysentery, or the bloody flux, a terrifying illness that ravaged the ranks. Men who had survived the journey and the fighting were reduced to skeletal figures, their strength drained away by relentless sickness. By the time Harfleur finally fell, Henry V's magnificent army had been gutted. Thousands of men, possibly 1/3 of his entire force, were dead, not by the sword, but by the stomach-turning cruelty of disease. Henry had won the port, but he had lost the campaign. The dream of a major, immediate conquest was over. All he could do now was retreat, but the sickness had stripped Henry's army from 15,000 strong down to 9,000 in weeks. By October, every man who survived the bloody flux was walking on courage, not strength. With the campaigning season closing, Henry V's only viable path was a 150-mile march to the English-held port of Calais. It was a humiliating, desperate move, less a march and more a slow, agonizing retreat. This was an act of raw survival. As they began their journey in early October, only about 6,000 of his men were fighting fit, the vast majority being the famous English and Welsh longbowmen. The route was a gauntlet. The army suffered from exhaustion, starvation, and the lingering effects of the flux. The psychological state of the English was one of deep, desperate fear. Henry had won a port, but lost an army. His only hope now was to surrender, or rely on a suicidal gamble. He would choose the battlefield where his defeat was guaranteed, but his survival might just be possible. The French reaction was one of mounting confidence and utter, paralyzing certainty. The great French host, led by their senior nobles, had shadowed Henry V's crippled force. They saw the English not as an army, but as prey. With estimates placing the French army at anywhere between 25,000 and 30,000 men, they outnumbered the English by at least 3 or 4 to 1. They had the numbers, the fresh supplies, and the home field advantage. The French command had strict orders to avoid an open battle, but to simply corner Henry and allow starvation and disease to do the work. But as Henry pressed toward the River Somme, the nobles' overwhelming confidence turned into an arrogant impatience. They were sure Henry's time was up, and they began mobilizing for the final, decisive confrontation. Their arrogance wasn't a flaw. It was a weapon Henry V knew how to use, and he would use it to commit a final act of utter defiance. The two armies finally came into contact on October the 24th, near the village of Agincourt, just 50 miles short of Calais. The stage was set for a battle that no one in either camp believed would last more than a single morning. Henry V, in a defiant act of military confidence, refused to retreat further, drawing a line in the mud. He knew his only chance was to force the issue now, while the French were still overconfident and disorganized. That night, under heavy rain, two crippled armies settled in for a long, cold vigil. For the English, it was a night of prayer and silent, grim resignation. For the French, it was a celebratory, noisy anticipation of an easy victory. They had trapped the English, but what they failed to realize was that Henry was not trapped by the terrain. He was about to use it as the most terrifying weapon in his arsenal. If you find this account of desperate survival and strategic genius compelling, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter in the most devastating military upset of the 15th century. On the morning of October the 25th, The French commanders looked out at the two armies separated by a newly ploughed field and saw certain victory. But Henry V had not chosen his battlefield, he had chosen his death trap. And that trap wasn't for the English, but for the pride and mass of the French themselves. The geography of the Agincourt field was the hidden genius of the English deployment. The field itself was a newly sown wheat field, flanked on both the west and the east by dense woodlands. The distance between the woods at the point of confrontation narrowed dramatically, creating a bottleneck or choke point that was barely 1,000 yards wide. This was the genius of Henry V's position. The French relied on their overwhelming numbers and their dense formations of heavy cavalry and men-at-arms. Henry, by placing his small, exhausted force directly within this narrow gap, effectively nullified the French advantage in sheer mass. The French army, in their eagerness, would be unable to flank the English, and their superior numbers would only serve to crowd their own ranks. The night before, heavy, cold rain had fallen, saturating the field. The French, wearing full-plate armor, an expensive suit of armor could weigh 50 pounds or more, would find their movement critically impaired by the churned, heavy clay. This was a detail the French nobles, confident of a decisive, close-quarters slugfest, fatally ignored. The mud of Agincourt was not an inconvenience, it was a strategic weapon, waiting to consume the French advance. The English deployment was precise and counterintuitive. Henry V placed his few thousand men-at-arms in the center, a thin, solid line, but the real power of the army was deployed on the flanks. The vast majority of his force, approximately 4/5 of his army, were the famed longbowmen. Henry deployed these archers in two large wedges on either flank, right up to the tree line. But their primary weapon that morning was not the bow, it was the stake. Every English archer was issued a sharpened wooden stake, 7 feet long, pointed at both ends. Before the battle, the archers hammered these stakes into the soft mud at a shallow, forward-facing angle, creating an impassable, jagged wall. This simple, brilliant, and inexpensive fortification instantly transformed the muddy field into an anti-cavalry meat grinder. Any French horsemen charging the flanks would be impaled on the stakes long before they reached the archers, or they would be forced to bunch up in the center, clogging the formation even further. For hours, the two armies stood in the miserable, cold silence, observing the vast distance between them, about 350 yards. The French, confident in their numerical superiority, refused to initiate the attack. Henry, however, could not wait. His men were sick and starving, and a protracted standoff would be a slow death sentence. Around 11 o'clock in the morning, Henry V gave the order to advance. In a high-risk gamble, the English army silently marched their line forward, stopping just within extreme longbow range of the French. Henry had forced the issue. The English, by moving, were signaling that they were not defeated and they were not going to wait for death. Henry gave the final order, nunc age, nunc viri, now act, now men. The archers pulled the stakes out of the ground, replanted them, and waited. The French nobility were enraged and humiliated by this audacity. Convinced that the English were about to flee and unwilling to let the prize escape, they launched a suicidal, disorganized attack. The French men-at-arms, clad in their heavy, expensive armor, began their slow, deadly march across the field toward the narrow gap. The stage was set, not for a battle of skill, but for a simple, terrifying calculation of physics and mud. The two lines were finally set in motion. The first wave of French men-at-arms, a vast, colorful, but critically disordered force, began their advance. They were about to learn that in the narrow confines of Agincourt, their pride and their armor were not their strength, they were their chains. The first French wave began not with a glorious charge, but a slow, heavy slog through the churned mud. As they closed the distance, the initial arrow storm was deadly, but secondary to a far worse enemy, momentum. When the front ranks hit the English lines, the sheer mass of the thousands behind them kept pushing, turning the vanguard into a suffocating, bloody compression. The French initial formation was a complete strategic failure. The small contingent of French heavy cavalry that was supposed to clear the English archers on the flanks was disorganized and ineffective. The archers' stakes, combined with the heavy mud, scattered the charge, forcing the horses to turn and crash back into their own advancing infantry lines. This created immediate chaos. The main French force was composed of thousands of dismounted men-at-arms, the flower of French chivalry, encased in the finest plate armor. These men were accustomed to close-quarters fighting, but the mud was their undoing. Moving in their 70-pound suits of armor, they quickly became exhausted, their lines slowing from a heavy trot to a desperate, trudging walk. They were essentially walking through an enormous, sticky trap. Before they had even reached the English line, they were met by the terrifying torrent of the English longbows. At 250 yards, the archers let loose. Each archer could fire up to 10 arrows per minute, unleashing a storm of tens of thousands of projectiles every 60 seconds. The dense French formation, meant to provide strength, only made them a thicker, more irresistible target. When the leading French ranks finally collided with the thin, stationary English line, the battle devolved instantly into a horrifying, human compression. The front rank of the French was immediately impaled upon the English short swords and axes. But the men in the front were not killed by the English weapons, they were killed by their own army. The thousands of French men-at-arms behind them, unable to stop or change direction in the mud and the narrow gap, continued to push forward. The pressure was immense. The front ranks were lifted off their feet and literally suffocated and crushed into the men in front of them, creating a massive, bloody pile-up. Men died not of a blow, but of having the air pressed out of their lungs by the combined weight of their own comrades and their heavy armor. The ground under the crush became a greasy, slick hill of mud, blood, and fallen men. Those who tripped could not get up, buried instantly by the falling bodies of their friends. The English, fighting on relatively firm ground, were able to use their shorter weapons, mallets, axes, and short swords to hack down at the exposed necks and heads of the French who were trapped and unable to defend themselves. The sheer physics of the battle were inescapable. The French army had crushed itself to death on its own front line. The massive casualties of the first French wave were an act of self-annihilation, not an act of English martial superiority. It was not a battle of men, it was a battle of geometry and mud. The defeat of the first wave was absolute. The English had won, but the horror was only beginning. When the exhausted English finally pulled themselves out of the collapsed pile of armor and corpses, they stood in a bloody, stinking, and utterly triumphant tableau. The first act of the massacre was over. With the first line defeated, the English stood ankle-deep in mud and blood, exhausted but victorious. Then, a new threat emerged. The fear that the thousands of captured French nobles, now secured in the English rear, might stage a revolt. This moment turned a brilliant military victory into a chilling, calculated massacre. The scene was one of chaos. The vast, mountainous heap of French bodies, both dead and trapped, was intermingled with thousands of prisoners. Capturing French noblemen was, traditionally, the primary goal of the battle. A nobleman was worth a fortune in ransom, the true prize of medieval combat. The English army, despite their exhaustion, had taken literally thousands of high-value prisoners from the first wave, tying them up and securing them in the English camp behind the main lines. But the French were not finished. While the battle for the center was ending, the fresh French third line, a massive, unengaged force, began to advance. Simultaneously, a small, opportunistic raid was executed on the English baggage train by local French skirmishers. This raid, though militarily insignificant, sent a shockwave of panic through the English camp, especially to the exhausted King Henry V. Henry was faced with an immediate, terrifying dilemma. He had an intact, fresh French army marching toward him, and his own army was exhausted, severely diminished, and now had thousands of enemy nobles, many of whom were armed or easily could be sitting directly behind them. If the French third line attacked, and the prisoners revolted, the English army would be destroyed from both front and rear. The victory he had just won would turn into a catastrophic slaughter. Henry V made a decision of ice-cold, ruthless necessity. He ordered the killing of the captives. This was not a spontaneous act of rage. It was a cold, calculated command to preserve the survival of his kingdom's army. It was an order that immediately clashed with the basic economic principles of medieval warfare. The English soldiers were horrified, not just by the violence, but by the destruction of their literal wealth. Henry was forced to put his own men to the sword to ensure the order was carried out. A small group of 200 men was detailed to execute the mass slaughter. The act was a logistical and ethical horror. The soldiers did not fight these men, they murdered them. They went through the lines of bound, high-ranking noblemen, killing them quickly with their daggers and axes. The chronicler who recorded the event noted that many of the English wept as they did this, the moral weight of the task almost unbearable. The execution order immediately sent a clear, chilling message across the field. The English would take no more prisoners. The French third line, seeing the sudden, terrifying violence being done to their captive comrades and knowing that their own lives were no longer worth a ransom, began to waver. Combined with the utter collapse of the first two lines, the third French force finally broke and fled the field. The mass execution of the prisoners, a morally unforgivable act, was a brutal tactical move that saved the English army and cemented Henry V's victory. This deliberate slaughter is critical to understanding the true numbers of Agincourt. The thousands of men executed by command were recorded not as combat dead, but as casualties of war. The historical accounts, written primarily by English chroniclers and French writers, often blurred the lines. But the hard reality is that the catastrophic French casualty count was achieved through a deadly combination of self-inflicted crushing and a command-level massacre, the butcher's arithmetic that secured the English win. We've seen the sheer brutality of this battle, but history is littered with conflicting accounts. If you know a piece of history that is often misreported or has a hidden dark truth like Agincourt, make sure to comment below and let us know what story you'd like us to tell next. When the sun set on Agincourt, the tally was immediately written into legend. Hundreds of English dead versus tens of thousands of French. But the truth is darker, messier, and far more political. To understand how many really died, we have to look past the royal chroniclers and into the cold, hard reality of medieval record-keeping. The official English accounts of the battle immediately sought to establish a narrative of divine intervention. Henry V needed a miracle to justify his invasion. Therefore, the casualty numbers were written to reflect a miracle. The English loss was incredibly low, sometimes cited at just over 100 men. The French loss was catastrophically high. The French, for their part, also had a vested interest in distorting the numbers. The scale of the defeat was too humiliating to be accepted. By exaggerating the total size of the army and the death count of the common soldiers, they could attempt to soften the incredible shame and political paralysis caused by the loss of their command structure. Modern historical analysis, however, allows us to recount the dead with more scrutiny. The official English loss of just over 100 men is almost certainly false propaganda. A battle of this intensity, fought on such brutal terrain, would have seen an English loss in the range of 300 to 600 men, a number still miraculously small, but far more realistic. The French losses are harder to pin down, but the total number is likely in the range of 7,000 to 10,000 dead. However, the number itself is not the true horror. The true horror lies in who died. The casualty figures from Agincourt represent an unprecedented disaster for the French ruling class. Historians estimate that of the 7,000 to 10,000 men killed, an utterly devastating number, likely between 40 and 50%, were the high-ranking nobility, dukes, counts, barons, and knights. The French lost 120 high-ranking noblemen and over 1,500 knights and squires, far more than any battle in the previous century. This was not a military defeat, it was a political decapitation. These men were the governors, the financiers, and the military commanders of France. The sheer scale of the slaughter of the aristocracy paralyzed the political and military structure of the kingdom for a generation. The ratio of high-ranking dead to common soldiers is the single, most devastating statistic of the entire battle. It was a demographic catastrophe for the ruling class that allowed Henry V to return 4 years later and dictate the terms of the Treaty of Troyes, briefly uniting the crowns of England and France. The Battle of Agincourt, therefore, was a victory secured by the genius of geography and a necessary act of brutal, calculated violence. King Henry V did not win because of a miracle, but because the French were defeated by their own arrogance, their own numbers, and the inescapable, terrifying physics of a narrow, muddy field. The true story of Agincourt is not of a miracle, but of a calculated gamble that turned the field into a human-crushing machine. The true story of history is often hidden in the numbers. If you want to see more accounts that peel back the layers of legend and reveal the dark, fascinating truth behind the world's most incredible battles, make sure to subscribe and join the conversation in the comments. And if you know someone who loves history, please share this video.